Dueck is an associate professor at George Mason in the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. And he studied politics. That means you got your PhD at Princeton. And where did you go to college?
I started out in Canada, University of Saskatchewan, and then I did my MPhil at Oxford.
Yes, okay, MPhil, and you were a Rhodes Scholar, I think.
Right.
Yes. All right, so that's his academic history. His first book was called Reluctant Crusaders, and then his second book was called Hard Line, the Republican Party and U.S. Foreign Policy Since World War II. So this is Colin Dueck.
Not Colin Powell.
Dueck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. So this book, the talk today is based on this book. The question that I pose in the book is, what is the Obama Doctrine, and is it working? And my interest for several years have been the intersection between presidential leadership, U.S. foreign policy strategies, and domestic politics. So I spend a particular amount of time looking at the domestic angle as well. So I noticed when I was motivated to write the book, if you Google the Obama Doctrine, you get a wide variety of options. There didn't seem to be any agreement on what it was. I saw everything from engagement to soft power to drone strikes to leading from behind, wide variety of interpretations. It's one of the things that motivated me to write the book. And the most plausible theory out there is probably that there is no strategy at all. In other words, if you look in specific cases like Syria or Ukraine, there doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy. And even some of the president's supporters actually say there's no strategy because we can't have one. The world's too complicated today. So if the definition of a grand strategy is that there's a really rigorous coherence between ends and means on a wide range of specific regional cases, then I think it has to be admitted it's not very coherent today. But I would actually say that some of the president's critics misread him in saying that there's no strategy whatsoever. If you take a more realistic or maybe a looser definition of strategy and say, inevitably there are trade-offs, there are assumptions, they're going to inform your choices, there is a kind of implicit grand strategy, even if it isn't coherent in every specific case. And I think there is evidence that there is an implicit overall foreign policy strategy with Obama. And if I have to sum it up in one sentence, which I guess I have to, I would say it's overarching American retrenchment and accommodation internationally, in large part to allow the president to focus on securing liberal policy legacies at home. Okay, so that's the thesis of the book. Now, one value added of the definition is that it incorporates domestic policy and political priorities, as I think governments do, into their consideration of foreign policy, which isn't necessarily scandalous, and I'm not suggesting that this is the first president to do so. I'm also not suggesting the sincerity of his foreign policy beliefs or of his domestic beliefs. What I am arguing that in his case specifically, his highest priorities are domestic, and that this has had a powerful effect on his foreign policy choices. He has governed, I think, with an eye on being one of the great progressive presidents in American history. That seems to be his self-image. So since his greatest ambitions are within the domestic policy arena, he's very reluctant to risk them through international or military policies that might shatter his domestic coalition. He keeps the final foreign policy decisions in his own hands. This is a highly centralized foreign policy apparatus within the White House. And he has a tight inner circle of White House advisors. This is pretty much agreed on by those who've studied his foreign policy closely. And so it's worth remembering his policies are not just a pragmatic response to a series of wars or overextension. There is a set of motivations that need to be understood, and there's three parts to it. As I said, there's retrenchment, there's accommodation, and then there's the domestic angle. So first of all, retrenchment. According to political scientists who study international relations, Peter Trubowitz, for example, retrenchment is a strategy designed to reduce a country's international and military costs and commitments. One particularly stark version of this might be what's called offshore balancing. I think Harvard's own. Is Stephen Walt still here at Harvard? Okay. Yeah. This would be a leading example. That would be a very stark version of retrenchment. And it's not as though Obama has embraced that version, but he has embraced a more modest, incremental version of retrenchment. So what you've got the last few years is an interesting test case for partial strategic retrenchment. Obviously, there are plenty of cases where tactically he goes the other direction. That's part of what makes him interesting, whether it's initially in Afghanistan or in some elements of counterterrorism, the Libyan intervention. But overall, I would say that the most striking thing in his policy has been not so much intervention or hawkishness as overall retrenchment. And even when he does intervene, it's done in a very light-handed way, which is very particular to him. So retrenchment. If you look at overall patterns of U.S. military spending, force posture, and security strategy, you find that under Obama, there have been some serious defense cuts, particularly since the Budget Control Act of 2011. There's been a shift away from defense toward domestic spending in relation to national economic activity. If you look at explicit security strategy, for example, the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, the U.S. abandoned the pretense that it would be able to fight two major regional contingencies simultaneously. So it de-emphasizes heavy-footed counterinsurgency or ground campaigns, stating that the U.S. would, quote, no longer be sized to conduct large-scale prolonged stability operations, right? So in other words, we're not going to do any more Iraqs. That was the theory. So some advocates of offshore balancing have actually said this is a move in the right direction. It's not far enough, but it's something. So then you have to ask, well, is this overall pattern of retrenchment working? I think it's had several, and I detail, there's one chapter in the book that's devoted simply to looking at internationally, is it actually working? And I think it's had several consequences he probably did not intend. First of all, most scholars of grand strategy, John Gaddis, for example, at Yale, have suggested there's always a trade-off in terms of cost and risk. So if you reduce the cost, you raise the risk, or vice versa. In Obama's case, he's pursued what you might call a more low-cost strategy, but there really hasn't been much explicit recognition that this involves higher risk. But it does. Current plans, like the 2012 DSG, basically assume, or you might say hope, that adversaries will not take advantage of America's scaled-back ability to handle a range of possible challenges. That's the essence of it. So there's a danger, obviously, that they might misperceive the true extent of U.S. commitment, and even under the impression the U.S. won't respond. So that's one danger. There actually is heightened risk, and you see that in practical terms in a lot of regional cases. The second downside is that even the current force posture embraced by the administration is actually incompatible with existing levels of defense spending. So capabilities and commitments are not aligned in U.S. grand strategy today. If you go back to Walter Lippmann, the Lippmann test, we call it, is your ends and your means have to be aligned. Well, today they are not aligned, and there's bipartisan agreement on all kinds of defense panels saying that either you're going to need to cut back commitments or increase capabilities. It doesn't add up at the moment. So even the more scaled back version that we saw with the 2012 defense planning is not actually being sufficiently resourced. And to be fair, this is congressional Republicans as well as the president that agreed on this starting in 2011. So the administration's preference for retrenchment had been visible in a number of regional cases. I mean, there's plenty to talk about in Q&A. Just one example was disengagement from Iraq in 2011. The defense of what the administration did has been to say, well, there really was no choice. Talks broke down over the issue of U.S. bases and whether U.S. troops would be immune. And so the U.S. had to leave. But interestingly, if you look at sympathetic chroniclers, like, for example, James Mann from SICE, it's clear the Obama White House really had no desire to maintain a significant number of troops in Iraq, and the Iraqis knew it. Here's what Mann says. And as I say, Mann likes Obama. Okay. U.S. military leaders had worried about the impact of a complete withdrawal from Iraq. But in political terms, making a clean break was much better for Obama than leaving some American troops in the country. Getting out of Iraq had been the central theme in the campaign that brought him to the White House. Any decision to extend the American troop presence there would be portrayed as a violation of these promises and of the dumb war views. In other words, Iraq had been a dumb war on which Obama's career in martial politics had been based. In other words, Obama clearly favored U.S. retrenchment from Iraq. He wasn't interested in spending much capital to prevent it. So talks broke down, and U.S. troops abandoned their bases very quickly. And there's plenty of blame to go around if you want to look to the origins of the current chaos in Iraq and the rise of ISIS. But part of the blame has to do with the U.S. withdrawal in 2011. Now, sometimes Obama emphasizes his overarching desire for retrenchment, even when he temporarily asserts U.S. power, the point I mentioned before. So, for example, when first escalating in Afghanistan, there were a series of very tight restrictions around that escalation. And then by 2011, Obama was able to claim that the tide of war is receding and announce a series of U.S. troop withdrawals. The impression of then Secretary of Defense Gates was that the president remained set on retrenchment apart from any military arguments. What he said in his memoir is, for him, Obama, it's all about getting out. So what you're signaling there again to both friends and adversaries is obviously a profound ambivalence about whether the U.S. is going to stay or whether it should be there at all. And you see this combination of sometimes verbal assertions with material retrenchment or de facto non-intervention. It often produces some disturbing policy outcomes. We have the pivot to Asia, but we have cuts to the Navy. We had an intervention in Libya, followed by de facto policy of U.S. disengagement, right? Libya is a failed state today. It's a disaster. In Syria, you had the goal of regime change, which was embraced by Obama, calling on Assad to step aside and drawing a red line, announcing American support for non-jihadist rebels, and then not one of those goals was implemented in a serious way. So altogether, the result is you have a president who actually frequently says the right things. In other words, we support our allies. But they will not only look at the rhetoric, they will look at the actions. And since the words exist alongside some pretty strong indicators of American retrenchment, there's often confusion abroad as to whether the U.S. is coming or going. The feeling in a number of allied capitals is that the U.S. is stepping back from its traditional world role. And that does carry risks. There is a downside. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the advocates of offshore balancing, when they look at this record, say the problem is we haven't retrenched enough. Right? It would be interesting to see at what point do you begin to admit that there is any downside to retrenchment, any possibility of unintended consequence in a negative way. So that's retrenchment. Now, on accommodation, I said that was the second part, accommodation. So authors like Charles Kupchan at Georgetown have talked about this strategy and supported it. A strategy of accommodation, according to Kupchan, for example, is an attempt to alter the demands, intentions, or ambitions of a potential opponent, distinct from simple bargaining. Bargaining entails mutual simultaneous concessions without any expectation of changing the other actor's intentions. Accommodations, on the other hand, typically begin with a one-sided concession toward the target state, some gesture of goodwill in the hope of triggering a subsequent process of mutual conciliation and possibly friendship. So there's a risk of exploitation. It has to be deliberate in order to be convincing. I'm not suggesting that the president sat down and read Kupchan's book, but there is an assumption that has clearly informed the policy since 2009, and it comes through in both words and actions. And Obama has said since he first ran for president that this is what he had in mind. He suggested that more open-minded diplomacy, compromise, and mutual dialogue, sparked by American example under his leadership, might trigger broad changes in the demands, intentions, and ambitions of what he considered to be superficially hostile states. And that is a premise of a strategy of accommodation. So again, how's it working out? Well, you can look at a number of cases. For example, in the case of Russia, you had the attempted reset starting in 2009, and there were, in a number of ways, the administration tried to accommodate Russian concerns, right? Playing down, for example, human rights as a major issue in relations with Moscow, easing Moscow's accession into the World Trade Organization, downplaying prospects for NATO's expansion into Georgia or Ukraine, and just more generally refusing to see the need for any kind of competition with Moscow for influence within former Soviet republics. So the purpose of the more conciliatory approach, as its own proponents described it, was not only to secure Russian cooperation on specific issues like arms control, but to kickstart a broader process of cooperation between the two powers. Well, evidently it did not work as planned. A very striking pattern since the beginning was Russia's persistent assertiveness under Putin relative to the United States. You had, in spite of this attempt, you had violent objections to any form of U.S. missile defense, continued occupation of portions of Georgia, technical support for Iran's nuclear program, the blocking of any UN action against Syria's violent suppression of domestic opposition. And in fact, Putin used the time to consolidate his authoritarian system at home. This is all before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It seems as though Putin secured what he could from the reset and was prepared to move on without any real pretense of friendly relations. And this pattern was already clear a couple of years ago. A similar case is on the nuclear side, particularly with Iran, but more generally, this is a long-standing interest of Obama's, the concept of nuclear abolition, which he laid out in Prague in 2009. And he came in arguing that with some modest concessions, the U.S. could help kickstart a broader process. And he made it clear he didn't expect this to happen, even in his own lifetime, never mind his administration, but that at least you could get some positive outcomes by making these concessions. What's actually happened, of course, is there's not much indication that these well-intentioned changes or concessions have resulted in reduced nuclear arsenals in other cases, in the cases of hostile countries. Just to take the case of Iran, you began with an effort on the part of the president to kickstart negotiations. In a good way, it combined sanctions, covert action, pressure. There was a lot to it that was positive. Then, when the Iranian people elected a new president, Hassan Rouhani, the White House seized the opportunity to really negotiate in earnest. And so you had first an interim agreement, and now, of course, you have a done deal. The risk of the agreement is that it gives financial relief to the regime, legitimizes it, and actually strengthens it unintentionally on the pretense that it might be more friendly to U.S. goals in the region down the road. And actually, Obama has said something which indicates this is what he thinks. So with an interview with Thomas Friedman in the New York Times earlier this year, his argument was, who knows, Iran may change. In other words, it's worth making some concessions if it brings about the possibility of altered intentions on the part of the Iranian regime. So it's a hope that down the road intentions may change. So that can be kind of a thin reed. Well, in domestic terms, I would actually say the Obama Doctrine's had more success. After all, if a key concern inside the White House was to prevent international military entanglements from derailing the president's domestic agenda or his reelection, then it has to be said he accomplished this. During his first term, whatever substantial problems there were with his foreign policy, he gave the public much of what it wanted on foreign policy, which was a staggered withdrawal of American troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, the avoidance of major new ground interventions, and an end to Osama bin Laden. And the last of these in particular allowed him to run for re-election as an incumbent president with a clear political edge on foreign policy issues. This was a remarkable reversal of traditional partisan advantages. And of course, congressional Republicans put up staunch opposition to many of his policies from the beginning. But by any reasonable standard, from his own point of view, the Obama years have seen, I would say, dramatic and sweeping policy changes in a liberal direction on a whole host of issues. Healthcare, financial regulation, same-sex marriage, and the environment. And what's interesting is in no significant case have they been held hostage to major diplomatic or military controversies. So in that sense, the Obama Doctrine has achieved its purpose, at least up until now. Interestingly, during the summer and fall of 2013, Obama's foreign policy approval rating dropped below 40% in multiple polls, and it has never really bounced back to those first-term levels. Now, to some extent, this dovetailed with an overall decline in the president's popular approval across the board, but there was enough of a distinctly steep and sudden drop in his foreign policy scores worth noting. The initial catalyst seems to have been his handling of the 2013 Syria crisis. And while the general public was no more enthusiastic than Obama about the prospects of U.S. airstrikes in Syria, voters also appear to have been disturbed by the president's foreign policy leadership style, which came across as indecisive. So ironically, his evident desire to consider every last possible objection to his own Syria policy may have been self-defeating politically, since in the end the overpowering impression was one of confusion. And as of today, his foreign policy approval ratings have not actually recovered. They've been typically about 38 or 39% for the past 2 years. So it may be that the rather disengaged international approach from the first term has now come back to haunt him in the domestic sense, although he will not be on the ballot again. It would be a mistake to assume the Obama Doctrine will benefit Democrats in 2016 necessarily. It might not. It clearly did in 2012. But if retrospective voting is a problem for presidents of either party, then if your foreign policy approval rating is in the high 30s, the nominee from the same party would have a hard time escaping that, regardless of how they position themselves. So it at least leaves an opportunity for Republicans to make their case. And we can see that Republicans are capable of self-destructing, and I would say that, voters expect, first of all, from a potential commander-in-chief, somebody who's measured, plausible, tough, capable. So you're going to have to match up against the likely Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton in that way. And it's also possible that a Republican could come across as too hawkish or too interventionist. That could be a danger. On the whole, though, if an incumbent Democratic president's approval rating on these issues is in the high 30s, the nominee from the same party will have a very hard time escaping that politically, particularly if she has served in that administration and is linked to that policy. There is no way of getting around it. Not to mention the fact that she's representing many of the same constituents. So I'm not convinced that foreign policy will necessarily be an advantage for Clinton next year in the way it was for Obama in 2012. So the Obama Doctrine may have worked for 5 years politically, but whether it continues to work next year, I'm not so convinced. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Colin. Questions? Avi Nelson.
Going back to your premise that somehow foreign policy was a predicate or conditional subordinate to domestic policy. Now, I wonder if that was actually the case. I mean, from the very beginning, from the apology tour when he first entered the White House, and even if you want to go back before that to his mentor in the 20 years in Jeremiah Wright's church, there seemed to be an antipathy to the United States application of force, a sense I have that he thought that many of the ills of the world were because the United States had been too powerful and applied too much of its own interests in world affairs going back over the decades. So I wonder if there was, now maybe it dovetailed nicely with his domestic agenda, but I wonder if he actually thought that, well, let me set foreign policy in some kind of standby mode so I can concentrate on domestic policy, or whether he actually likes the, or supportive of the idea that retrenchment in the sense of diminution of American strength and involvement in the world was a good idea, just in some fundamental philosophical, ideological sense.
I think he does believe that if you go back to the 80s, for example, he actually wrote an article when he was a student at Columbia for the Sundial. It was called, actually I have a mention of it here. It's called something like Breaking the War Mentality. And he called for nuclear disarmament. He called for, he attacked the military-industrial complex. Sort of standard stuff from the anti-war movement in the 80s. It's called Breaking the War Mentality. He voiced his revulsion against Cold War militarism, military-industrial interests, and what he called their billion-dollar erector sets, right? So, that's what he was saying. Now, you could say, obviously, he's come a long way since then. He's president of the United States. He's become more, more respectable over the years, more mainstream. But I think hawkish, more hawkish. Too hawkish for Bernie Sanders, put it that way. But at the same time, I think he splits the difference. I think he is convinced in some ways that America has done some harm overseas, right? I mean, he said as much. When he wrote about his experience in Indonesia, he said, we haven't always done good things abroad. So he splits the. I wouldn't say he's Alinsky. Is that his name? Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky.
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's Alinsky. I would say Obama splits the difference between a view that U.S. power in the world can do some good, and U.S. power in the world in the past has done some bad. And this is very characteristic for Obama, right? It's unusual for Commander-in-Chief to hold that view. I mean, it's been more common historically, whether Democrat or Republican, to have just a more unreserved positive view of America's role in the world, including its military role in the world. But I think Obama, I think at heart, he buys a lot of the arguments of the anti-war movement, and he rose to power on its passion initially, and that goes back to his own convictions as a student in the 80s. Yeah.
Yes, Andy.
I'd just like to follow up on Bobby's question, maybe to contrast Obama's view as you see it with Bill Clinton's, because I think that would be helpful in terms of the last president who was a Democrat, his view of America's role on the world stage, and where Obama is. I mean, surely Clinton would have acknowledged that there were examples in America's past where interventions hadn't gone entirely her way, but he was, to obvious point, less averse in a certain way to the view that America could do an awful lot of good on the world stage. It just seems very hard to think of examples over the past years of Obama's being commander-in-chief where he's asserted that forcefully and stood behind it. How would you respond to that?
So Clinton's an interesting contrast. So there's some similarities. I mean, but
Bill Clinton.
Yes.
Right.
Bill Clinton.
Right. Bill Clinton. If there was a central concept in the 90s under Clinton, it was probably what was called democratic enlargement. I think it was Tony Lake that coined the phrase. So that's very different from Obama. Democratic enlargement was the post-Cold War optimistic assumption that you could expand the zone of market democracies into Eastern Europe, East Asia, Latin America, and so it was positive. Now, Clinton wanted to do this on the cheap, for sure. There was a very low tolerance for the possibility of U.S. casualties, for example, in cases like Kosovo, right? And Clinton was highly sensitive to domestic political considerations. I would say in some ways Obama is more of a conviction politician than Bill Clinton was in that sense. But I don't think that Clinton was as pessimistic as Obama about the possibilities of the uses of American power. That concept of democratic enlargement, it's hard to see Obama embracing that. And it's a different era. We're in the post-Iraq era, and so Obama is a post-Iraq Democrat, right? It shifted the debate.
But Clinton was a post-Vietnam Democrat. So I was trying to figure out how we get to a place in terms of understanding Obama. I agree with you. I look at Obama as extremely ideological, having a strong point of view about a lot of these questions. Yeah. But one that is at least hard to understand as, from the point of view of a strong America being good for the world.
Well, Clinton, let's remember, yes, he's post-Vietnam, and that's an important experience for him and for his party. So he's drawing lessons from Vietnam, which is to say, let's not make the same mistake. We can't just repeat early Cold War policies. But if you recall, in '92, what kind of a foreign policy did Clinton campaign on? He was relatively hawkish, relatively internationalist, relatively pro-trade, right? He's clearly understanding that, first of all, Democrats are not, in his view, I think, are not going to win back the White House unless they talk that way. And that was number one. You cannot sound like George McGovern and win back the White House. But number two, there wasn't any indication that Clinton had a principled commitment to McGovernism. So the combination of the politics of it and the belief system is he's going to be a more middle of the road Democrat on these issues who's not really. If you compare that to Obama, right? I mean, Obama ran to the left of Hillary Clinton in 2008. He was the anti-war Democrat. So that's very different positioning from Clinton '92. I don't know if that answers your question.
If I can ask just one more follow-up.
Sure.
Okay, so I see where Clinton '92 and what his presidency was like and where Obama was. And I look at let's say, McGovern's rhetoric, never became president. McGovern seems to be more patriotic, I would say, than Obama. How would you respond to Obama's sort of view of, as you said, he was unusual for a commander-in-chief to express the views that he's expressed?
You know, I actually think the way Obama seems to view if you look at one of his 2 autobiographies, not Dreams of My Father, but the other one, I'm forgetting the title. He has an interesting way of thinking about
Audacity of Hope?
Audacity of Hope, thank you. I think in some ways the way he talks about the founding and the American tradition is very interesting. I mean, his definition is that the progressive cause, the liberal cause, the American tradition, and just sheer common sense are all one and the same. I mean, it's a very interesting and powerful way of talking about it. To me, there's
so my question is only Obama in the world stage, not the way he captures his...
Well, my point is to say, I actually don't think he's... I'm not suggesting I wouldn't say he's unpatriotic. I think he has a liberal point of view that defines his patriotism and vice versa. I don't argue that he's unpatriotic. I argue that it's a... In fact, I think he's rhetorically... He managed to hit on something in 2012, especially some of those speeches, that was pretty powerful. It's not my view because I'm conservative, but you know, my hat is off to him. To campaign as a forthright progressive and win on foreign policy, cultural and economic issues has not been the normal pattern in American history for some time. Clinton never did that. You know, so this is something impressive. And I don't really question his patriotism in the book. I try to lay out, you know, his foreign policy views. I think he clearly takes us in the great American debate between liberals and progressives. He takes sides. He's a liberal. He is not a conservative. He's not in the middle. The notion that he's post-ideological or post-partisan or purely pragmatic, I mean, temperamentally or tactically he can be extremely pragmatic, but he's not literally in the middle of that fight. So, you know.
Yes, Pat.
Yes. Well, first of all, just a comment. I would suggest that to be critical of certain aspects of American foreign policy is not per se unpatriotic or even suggested. So
well, that's what I mean about McGovern. I was characterizing McGovern's assertion of America's role in the world stage as not unpatriotic. I was asking in the question between Clinton and Obama, responding to Colin's point about how it's unusual for a commander-in-chief to this frequently question whether America's role in the world is for the good.
Even if I still think, but anyway, my question is, it seems to me what the Obama doctrine, which I'm probably much more sympathetic to than you are, what it does is raise the question as to what are the limits of power,
right.
Power within the world stage, and you know, maybe I have a rather skewered view of world history, but in general, when I look at the decline of the great powers throughout history, it seems to me that overextension has always been an element. Whether you're talking about the British or going back to the Roman or the Spanish or whatever that you would do historically, and that, it seemed to me, was part of the lesson in with Iraq, was that there was this view within the Bush administration that we could go in and remake Iraq into a democracy, which of course requires considerable resources to do that. And if you start multiplying that throughout the world stage, that's a fairly large agenda that is being engendered. So I think that, and maybe there have been some limitations with Obama, and you know, and Syria, frankly, I think the best thing in Syria would have been just simply to have let it be and not attempt to, you know, Saddam. The same thing I would have said with Iraq. You had in Iraq with Hussein, you had the best buffer against Iran with having Hussein in there. You take him out, and all of a sudden, who's in Iraq but Iran? But anyway, the broader issue is, what are the limits of power? How far can you go? Should the U.S. be interested in what happens to Crimea?
Yeah.
You know, something which has traditionally been within the orbit of Russia going back for centuries.
Right.
So,
okay, and that I think is the strongest defense you can make of Obama, which is to say there was a period of strategic overextension. There needed to be some retrenchment. We needed to relearn the limits of power after this kind of post 9/11 excessive optimism, right? Fair enough. But what lessons of history are often drawn, we were talking about this at dinner last night, are often drawn, political psychologists tell us, in ways that are overdone or a little bit myopic. So now we have a lesson, which is Iraq. And I think particularly in Obama's case, and also for many Americans, the lesson that has been drawn is now over-applied. So I think you're right. There is no button that we can push and say that, you know, tomorrow Iraq will be a stable democracy. There's no such button. But if we are constantly telling ourselves that we have very little ability to cause any kind of positive change, even in our own interests, in all kinds of cases, whether it's Ukraine, Iraq, the China Seas, you name it, it will become self-fulfilling. And that's what's happening right now, it seems to me, is that we talked ourselves into almost a funk. It's almost a kind of a national depression where we believe that our power is so limited. The U.S. power isn't actually that limited. The U.S. has incredible capabilities if it chooses to exercise them. I mean, it's still by far the leading power on earth. So no, we can't push a button and say democracy in Syria. But if you go into a case like Syria already convinced of your own powerlessness and that nothing you do is going to do any good, of course that's the result you'll get. And that's exactly what we've seen. The White House basically has been saying for years in private, and the body language that has been communicated is nothing we do is going to make a difference, so we're not going to do anything. And we'll give some speeches, but we can't really make any difference. So people will draw the obvious conclusions, which is, all right, I suppose the U.S. intends to have no impact on this situation. So I'm sympathetic, actually, to your first point, but I think the lessons have now been overdrawn. We've overreacted to the overextension. That would be the way I would put it.
Yes.
A comment on a couple questions. I've read your book, 90% of it. It's excellent.
Well, thank you.
I think that I know you. I hope you're not offended when I say that I believe Obama would find much in it even most of it to agree with, not your conclusions. I'm unhappy, or it seems to me that nobody who came fresh to foreign policy, anybody who comes fresh to foreign policy, this is an excellent book to read, but such a person would have no idea that in his first presidential campaign, Obama's model for the ideal foreign policy president was President Bush the father.
Bush 41.
I think my two chief, perhaps my two chief objections or deep concerns about your book relate to defense and to the question of allies. You seem to feel we've abandoned or even betrayed a number of allies. Well, we certainly abandoned Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. He deserved it. But I don't think you can name any other allies, certainly not any countries, that we have abandoned. Now, with regard to defense spending, defense spending is an issue that I'm no expert, and it's hard for me to understand. But if we take the most commonly repeated statistic about American defense spending, I think it is that the United States spends on military matters about 4 or 5 or whatever it is times as much as the next country in terms of military spending. And when we consider both that many of those other countries are military allies of the United States, your wish that we move closer to 4% of GDP a year as compared to you think Obama, well, wants to move us toward 3%. The Globe 2 days ago in an editorial suggested we're now at 3.6%. But given the overall fact that, I mean, he's maintained military primacy. I don't think any bases other than in Afghanistan and Iraq have been shut down. So it seems to me that your attack on his treatment of the levels of defense spending is unfair.
Okay. So the 3 points that on Bush 41, I think that it's very useful for Obama to suggest the comparison because in retrospect, everybody likes Bush 41. I mean, everybody agrees, that's kind of the most prudent, sensible, yet tough combination. So we all like Bush 41. But I think we're talking about two very different presidents. I mean, Bush 41 was a foreign policy president who was intimately familiar with the details of the issues. He pursued a genuinely prudent policy in a number of cases. And sometimes, if you remember the joke from Saturday Night Live was wouldn't be prudent. I mean, that was Bush 41. But Obama's, I touched on this point before, temperamentally Obama comes across as very calm, very measured. That is sometimes mistaken for the substance of prudence on foreign policy and defense. On military matters, it is often the case that the most prudent response is actually, to mention Colin Powell, overwhelming force. Once you've decided on the use of force. So if you look at Bush 41 in Iraq, that's exactly what he did. That was prudent. The pattern under Bush 41 was to say either we're going to implement this or we're not going to talk about it. It was actually quite wise. Obama's very different creature in terms of how he's handled a number of cases like Syria, like Afghanistan, like Libya. This is not prudent. This is not prudent. Prudence is not simply doing the smallest amount as slowly as possible until a catastrophe develops. That is not prudence, and I think that's what we're seeing in so many cases with Obama. I mean, we're hearing that Libya was a terrific exercise of smart power. It is a failed state. It's a playground for jihadists. It's a playground for organized crime, and it's a complete disaster. So I don't even know why this would be referred to as a success. On the point about allies, there are numerous allies. It depends on exactly who you're talking to. In the Middle East, in parts of East Asia, Japan, for example, in parts of Europe, for example, Central Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, there really is concern as to, is the U.S. here to stay? Is it going to support us, or is it going to sort of gradually walk away as we see Russia or China or Iran on the horizon? This is real. It's a real concern. So it's not that Obama's been so rash as to just completely dismantle, the alliance system, but these allies really are worried. I mean, Middle Eastern allies worry about the Iran deal. Japan worries as to whether the U.S. will enforce red lines. The Baltics and Poland and Romania worry as to whether the U.S. will ever stand up to Russia. So the worry is real, and it's a trade-off. I'm not pretending this is an easy one. There's always a trade-off between, on the one hand, you don't want to get pulled into unwanted conflicts, right? That's the being entrapped, it's called, by your allies. But at the same time, if you go too far, there is a fear of abandonment, which becomes very real and which can lead to all kinds of problems. Your allies can end up, for example, lashing out in ways that you might not want because they feel distanced from the U.S. So I think it's a real problem today. And just quickly on defense, it's true the U.S. spends more than anyone else by far, but the U.S. plays a different role in the world. It has a set of alliance commitments that are in a completely different league from any other country. So, as I said, according to the Lippmann test, you have to ask, what is U.S. defense spending compared to existing commitments? And so, for example, the Quadrennial Defense Review 2014, there was a bipartisan national defense panel, Democrats and Republicans, unanimous agreement, we are not spending enough on defense compared to what our commitments are. That's the test, in a sense, and we're failing the test. So if you want to say, if you want to just say, well, I don't want to spend more than 3%, then you would have to really cut back on your commitments in a serious way. You would have, and then you have to ask, well, what does that mean? Are you willing to take those risks? Are you, which particular alliance are you going to dismantle? Are you going to say we're not going to defend Japan anymore? We're not going to defend, you know, NATO. I mean, what's the commitment you propose dismantling? Because there is a disconnect today. The Joint Chiefs have said this repeatedly as well. They're lacking confidence that they can implement even existing plans.
If I may be allowed to follow up,
Just this once, Roger. Just this once.
he got 3. We sailed a military vessel past, we just in the last week infuriated the Chinese by sailing a military vessel past one of those islands they built up in the South China Sea. We're bombing ISIS, we're working with our allies in a wide variety of areas that I could list, but let me focus in on just one country, Libya. We had to act quickly rather than prepare a thorough plan because nobody wanted to intervene at all, but of course his women advisors pressured him not to permit a massacre, a genocide. And
did you just say women?
Yes. Well,
the Valkyries.
Our speaker knows more about the background than I do, but I think that's the widespread understanding that well, Susan Rice and probably Hillary and certainly the...
Don't forget Samantha Power.
And Samantha, yeah, Samantha, were his chief advisors in preventing the, well, so that he did not have to, in the future, give the kind of apology that Bill Clinton has had to give for Rwanda. But, okay, we certainly didn't have a plan for the aftermath, and the aftermath was a chaotic disaster. But you do the best you can in numerous foreign policy situations, and remember Churchill's classic quote about the least worst. I don't think, given public opinion and Libya, that a much better outcome. I think you're wrong to suggest that he or anybody in his administration regards Libya as a big success. It was the least worst way of handling an impossible situation that Libya was and continues to be.
Wasn't Clinton in the administration? She called it just in debate the other day. She said it was a worthwhile exercise of smart power. I mean, look, I would say that this was an example of the lesson of Iraq, and there was no appetite for a lot of troops on the ground, and I would say understandably so. But at a minimum, what about helping the new government with security services? I mean, some kind of technical security foreign assistance. There wasn't even that. So you'll get plenty of foreign policy experts on the Democratic side over the years who've said, you know, please, can we do that? Democratic Party, you know, liberal internationalists saying we would like to follow up with the 2011 action by supporting the nascent government of Libya, and it wasn't done. So it's just one of these examples where, in practical terms, it's failed execution. There's just a lack of executive sensibility with the current. There's so many cases where there's words, but there isn't action. There is not a practical execution or implementation of the stated policy. Secretly, I think this is what the Clinton team believes they will be better at, is in terms of practical execution of foreign policy. On the point about ISIS and bombing, you know, you often hear the defense is to say, well, we're doing this and we're doing that. We're doing all these things, so it's fine. You know, be patient. That's what the last national security strategy said, was it's strategic patience. But look at the details of the bombing campaign against ISIS. It is zero tolerance. It's really a very limited campaign. It might be admirable in a way, in humanitarian terms, to say we're unwilling to bomb ISIS if there's any risk of civilian casualties. That is basically the White House's position. They've communicated that. But what that means is there is no hope of a serious bombing campaign. It's a misunderstanding of what war is. War is not humanitarian. I don't believe there is such a thing as a humanitarian war. If you're going to roll back ISIS, you will have to go to war in a serious way. This will involve the risk of civilian casualties. The White House has made it clear they don't want that. So we've got the most limited bombing campaign because of the fact that there is this set of restraints that have been imposed from the White House on down.
You certainly don't have that kind of restriction with regard to the drone campaign, because a lot of civilians have been killed in that regard. Why, if we don't have this particular restriction in the drone campaign in more than one country, I think, does he have this restriction in dealing with ISIS?
That's a puzzle. Yeah.
Because drones don't kill Americans, which is a very different...
You think the fear with ISIS is that the administration doesn't want to risk killing American prisoners or something like that?
No. Losing lives in another war. Losing American soldiers' lives in another war. Drones avoid that.
Yeah.
I got a question about your statement, your description of Obama as a forthright progressive. It doesn't strike me as quite accurate. Forthright I think is right. that he's not improvising, and he has it thought out. But my ideal of the forthright progressive would be John Stuart Mill, who said that civilized countries are right to govern despotically barbaric countries. That's not a correct quotation, but that's the idea of it. So he was forthright that progress was much better than barbarism, and civilization was much better than barbarism, and you see this also in the American progressives. Teddy Roosevelt was a forthright progressive. He was sure that America was better than Spain, and Spain was probably better than Cuba. He had this picture of something better than that. But liberalism in our time, or progressivism in our time, seems to be much more self-critical, in that it's not sure that civilization is better than barbarism, and this comes in a kind of theoretical position of relativism, which turns into a political or social doctrine of multiculturalism. No one culture, especially not our culture, is better than the others, and so we're much enriched if we have a multiculture, and then multiculture must perhaps give precedence to cultures that are closer to barbarism than civilization. There's something wrong with civilization. And whereas in political science there used to be this doctrine of first world, second world, third world, or developed countries versus underdeveloped countries. There the assumption was that to be developed is better than being underdeveloped, and to be in the first world is better than to be in the third world. But it seems now that that there's such a thing as an overdeveloped country, which is that results in kind of moral inferiority to the underdeveloped countries, and so I think there is something to this sort of post-liberal description of Obama. If you look at this picture of what liberalism has done to itself.
Well, and if that's a great way of putting it. I mean, and if that's your definition of progressive, then clearly he's not in that Mill TR tradition. In practical terms, when you look at liberals or progressives, if we're going to use the term synonymously, then there's always been an interventionist strain and an anti-interventionist strain. And the link has been, we cannot define U.S. intervention overseas as being in American interests. That's not the definition. Either the intervention has to be for some liberal or progressive end, let's say humanitarian or democracy, right? So Clinton in the 90s, you had in the Balkans, and among other cases. And that was kind of a high point for liberal interventionists, where a lot of these people cut their teeth. And even in the case of Germany, there was a moment where there was a strain of liberal interventionism, but I think Iraq meant that the liberal non-interventionist strain gained the upper hand, and it still has it to this day. So that's closer to what you're describing, which is to say a deep skepticism that, first of all, that this works in practical terms, that it's realistic, or that it's morally justifiable, that it does any good, that it's legal. There's a whole cluster of morals. So I think and that's where you get, if anything, Clinton today, the challenge is clearly from her left, which is to say, Obama's too hawkish, for God's sake, right? Too many drone strikes, too much on the military, too interventionist, too aggressive on counterterrorism. So that strain that you describe, I think, is something that's very strong. I would expect it to actually become stronger if a Republican wins the White House next year, because many of Obama's supporters at heart, I think, feel that way, but are willing to support half-heartedly policies that he poses because they think his heart's in the right place. If you had a Republican,
because they think what?
Because they think his heart is in the right place,
Yeah.
Whereas if you had a President Rubio or President Jeb Bush, I think you're going to see a critical number of liberals and progressives move back to a position that's closer to the one you describe, actually. Yeah.
Carly. Women advisor.
Yeah, this woman actually does agree that prudence sometimes requires more force as opposed to less. But so my question actually is about what a prudent strategy might have looked like, say with respect to Russia. One that was not overly negative about the extent to which our power was limited, but also not overly hopeful about us having limitless power, right? So what would have been, say, a prudent conservative strategy with respect to Russia, either leading up to the Ukraine invasion or following it?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So you're saying start instead of the reset 2009.
Yeah.
Okay. And look, Russia is much of what happens inside Russia is certainly well beyond our capacity to determine one way or another. So that's clear. I am not suggesting that if only we'd followed some other policy, Russia would today be a flourishing democracy. I think that's actually the mentality we have to break, to say the truth. What I would say is, why all of the concessions if it's not going to buy you the benefits? I mean, why did we have to concede on one thing after another with the reset? So number one would be, don't make the concessions. It's not to say we can't have business-like relations. It's not to say, it's not to say we have to go in guns blazing everywhere. I mean, this is one of the lessons of Iraq that we're constantly having to hear, is that the only alternative to the president's policy is World War III. You can have serious, cordial relations, and I actually think the Russians understand this sort of thing. You say, look, we have our interests, you have yours. We're going to compete in some ways. We're not going to be friendly on everything. We're not here primarily to scold you, but we're a major power who has our own interests, and there's going to be cases where we draw a line and enforce it. I actually think Putin understands that kind of thing perfectly well. In fact, I think he would respect that more than what he sees today. I mean, the sort of thing Obama does infuriates people like Putin. So I would say, just to bring it up to date, what we should be doing today is, I'm not saying bomb Russia. Okay, I'm saying counter-pressure Russia on the ground in serious, determined ways around the perimeter. Why can't we provide arms to the Ukrainian government? Why can't we pre-position U.S. forces in Poland? It would actually might make war less likely, because you would have a deterrent and you would transmit the sense that you're serious and that you're going to back it up. It might prevent violent misunderstandings. I think there's a real danger today of misunderstandings arising from deterrence failure. So I am glad to hear your opening remarks.
An incomprehensible move on the part of Obama to withdraw defensive missiles from, was it Poland and the Czech Republic?
Yeah.
These were defensive missiles, and Russia objected to them. What kind of a signal did it send to Putin when those missiles were withdrawn, inviting offensive involvement by the Russians? when we talk about things that could have been done differently, and that, I don't know why it's not done now, as a signal to Putin after Crimea and Ukraine, to put the defensive missiles back to indicate that at least there's some interest in limiting Russian power or expansion. You know, there was a comment earlier about Crimea has always been within the Russian orbit. Orbits are not fixed in their perimeter. If we show continued weakness, such as withdrawing defensive capabilities, that orbit is going to expand. And it's going to expand into Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia until somebody draws a line and says, stop, because that's what dictators do. That's what they've done in the past. Saddam Hussein did it, invaded Kuwait, was paying terrorists to blow themselves up. I mean, dictators are always interested in expanding their power. Somebody has to draw the line. The United States is the only one who can.
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot to that. I think the Estonians, for example, are petrified that what's going to happen one day is they will wake up and there will be a Crimea-type situation inside Estonia. Okay? It's not going to be Russian tanks roll over because the Russians are too smart to do that. It'll look more like Ukraine. Initially it'll be denied, it'll be covert, it'll be you wake up and there's Russians occupying a government building somewhere in Estonia. And then, as Putin has been doing, it's bit by bit, and you create the facts on the ground. And then in effect, you say, well, now are we invoking NATO? Are we invoking collective responsibility for defense? Because if we don't, how do you remove these people? And if you don't do that, is NATO hollow? Right? I mean, it's a possibility that Putin could get to the point where he has exposed NATO as hollow in cases like the Baltics, and that will resonate beyond the Baltics as well. So
and NATO is hollow except for the United States. I mean, if Putin were to know for sure the United States is not going to get involved, it wouldn't matter what other member nations of NATO are going to get involved. Putin wouldn't care.
I have some follow-up questions to some of the questions here and something you said. So I would like to become clearer about what you think the motivations of the administration are, because it seems there's some contradiction. So on the one hand, you said, well, the words of the administration do not live up to their deeds. And Hillary Clinton will be somebody to point that out and to say, I'll do better policy-wise. But that is at odds with saying people don't believe that anything can be done anyways. Unless you say no, there's appeasing words, but behind the scenes people know we're not going to do anything because we don't think anything will, decisively influence things for the better that we can do. And so that's one question, what's going on there. And then that plays into your comment on, Bush 1 was such a good foreign policy president because he understood that sometimes prudence requires overwhelming force. But where in the situation now could you actually apply that? So if all these smaller things, you could say Libya, Syria totally failed, okay. But, even like a huge bombing campaign against ISIS, which in my heart, of course, anybody would somehow like to see these people disappear. That would be just wonderful. But that means, or doesn't it mean that it would require, after that fact, or a huge commitment, again, boots on the ground, occupations of those countries helping? I don't know, it would seem it would be a kind of overwhelming force that would be required again. And there seems to be not really some big in-between thing, that can be done. And do Americans want that? Or is the situation so that good prognostications can be made about what good that would actually do, and in the long term, is it worth this? So those are my two questions. I don't know, were they clear?
So for the first one, take the case of Syria. If the policy in Syria seems incoherent, I think that's because it is. So each part of it might be sincere. So I'm willing to believe that. I'm willing to believe that Obama, when he initially said Assad must step down, believe this, I must step down, that in humanitarian terms he's awful. Fine. I'm also willing to believe that when he used the phrase red line, I mean, I don't believe a president of the United States would use the phrase red line without understanding that this might mean something down the road. So then that made sense, right? And keep in mind, now you're talking about a White House where there's almost an obsession on daily media messaging when it comes to foreign policy. So what are we going to say today to meet the 24-hour cycle? So each day, that makes sense on its own, okay? But it doesn't all add up, as you'll see. So then the next moment you say, we're going to aid moderate rebels, whoever they are. We're going to aid non-jihadist rebels. And then you say that over and over again for a period of years. And then, in reality, you get into the details of it, and the president comes to the conclusion that I don't really see any moderates. I don't really believe this is going to work anyway. I'm going to put the brakes on. I need to see more. Let's do more studies. And it doesn't happen. Each one of those components, I'm sure, makes perfect sense to him on its own merits that day. So I'm not questioning the sincerity of it. What it adds up to is a mess. One hot mess. Okay, so I am certainly not suggesting there's a coherent strategy in relation to a case like Syria. Just the opposite. What I am suggesting is, macro level, he has a kind of overarching strategy, which is retrench, accommodate, domestic. That's my argument. And then it informs cases like Syria, right? Some cases he's done better than others. I mean, to be fair, the Bin Laden strike, that was a good day. I like that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, he finally got behind that, because you'll notice when he believes that something is really important to his legacy, he will fight. Now, he believes the Asia pivot is important to his legacy. He was convinced that he needed to put some capital behind the TPP fight, and he bucked his own base, actually. And now it's passed. At least the fast track is passed. We'll see about the deal itself. But, you know, in cases where he really cares, he will fight. So that was to his credit. Now, on your point about force today, there's no exact comparison to Iraq 91. That was a unique set of circumstances. There are plenty of cases, though, today where the U.S. could act a little more forcefully if it wanted to, and if it was serious. So in the case of ISIS, we could certainly develop a bombing campaign that would do a lot more damage to ISIS. We could be, in fact, even now there's talk about increasing special operations ability to actually cooperate with allies on the ground, call in airstrikes, maybe have more of them on the ground. I mean, this has been a criticism for some time. So there's a lot more we could be doing against ISIS without 100,000 Americans on the ground. The special ops, if they're empowered, can really be tremendously useful, but they haven't been, right? So that would be a model where you could take the fight to ISIS and be more assertive. But you'll notice that the White House's position is always the same, which is there is no in-between. It's either us, or it's neocon, warmongering, World War III. Or they'll say something along the following lines, oh, we're already doing that. So there's never any valid criticism. So the truth is there really are plenty of options. The U.S. has all kinds of tools, military, economic, diplomatic, that it can apply in these cases if it wants to get serious. We talked about Russia. There's more the U.S. could do to deter Putin in cases like Ukraine and the Baltic states. In the East China Sea, you know, we talked about Japan. Now, Obama has said we support Japan and we will continue to support Japan, but you know, that could be a little more clear as well. So I think there actually is more that we could be doing. I'm not suggesting that I'm not talking about 500,000 troops on the ground toppling some random dictator as what happened in the case of 91. But I would like us to get past the illusion that any alternative to Obama's own policy means, you know, Third World War. We have a lot of options actually. Yeah.
Ross.
There are other interventions in between, such as target of knocking out North Korean facilities, and there wouldn't be a worldwide reaction against that. And Israel has done it with Syria. Nothing to do with troops on the ground. It's hitting nuclear facilities. And it's too late, I guess, in Iran. The point about orbits is very important. Orbits are fuzzy, and whose orbit is Taiwan in today?
Right.
Now, thanks to diplomacy and a certain rationality in Beijing, the situation on the ground means it's in our orbit, but we have allowed the principle to state that it's in China's orbit. Now, I'm not saying that's the solution forever, but it's been going on for 50 years. On China, one point. Obama went to China in November '09, and his people said, the bilateral stuff is good. Ken Lieberthal came up here in this building, said it'd be climate change and nuclear disarmament that China and America under Obama could do. Well, he went to China at the end of '09, and the Chinese, rightly or wrongly, judged him weak. Then, in 2010, China started being assertive in the South China Sea. And Jeffrey Bader and Obama's other people said China had changed. They got more assertive, and was Xi doing something for his legacy? But it was their reading of Obama that led to the 2010 change. And I think this reveals two things about Obama's entire, what did you call it, worldview. He has changed all the time, but that's not a totally good thing. He got strong on Japan, but he was very weak, dangerously so, when Abe came to Washington. He corrected that. And so inconsistency, and secondly, this vision of multilateralism that he's believed in for many years, I don't think it got replaced with anything. It didn't work, and some people told him that, but it wasn't replaced by what I'd call a steady view of U.S. interests. I don't think Obama has ever set out a view of U.S. interests. Now, there's intervention on behalf of worldwide principles. That's what he would have liked, but that's not, it's not easy to find what the target would be there. And,
I agree with that entire statement. I find nothing to object to.
Right. Yeah, very good. That's Ross Terrell. Alberto.
Yes, I have a question which is also related to the topic of multilateralism versus unilateralism. And it is not actually about Obama's vision of foreign policy, but it is about what very recently Tony Blair said regarding the fact that those who removed Saddam Hussein have a responsibility for what is going on in Syria and Iraq right now. And so my question is, what do you think about that? And precisely regarding the fact that multilateralism might have failed, but my impression is that unilateralism perhaps had failed even more. So the picture seems to be very, very complicated. And another point I would like to make, which is a comment, is that my impression is that Obama felt and has still feeling weak, also because the basis of his government is probably weaker than earlier. Right? So he has to deal with a huge economic crisis, they wanted to focus on other things such as the reform regarding healthcare and so on. Money was limited, and so I think they had in a way to choose some priorities. And because of these many things, I think that they were forced to choose a different stance towards foreign policy. I understand that this can seem weak. It is surely very undecisive and inconsistent. This is my impression. But in a certain sense, I think they were, as an administration, they were forced to do that. I mean, it is clear that it is not as easy as it used to be for the United States to play the role as the only superpower because of the economic fundamentals. I think this is the problem. So this involves the necessity to create a more multilateral situation, but this is complicated because, of course, there are countries which in that picture should play a much more important role, such as Japan, such as Germany, and this would change a situation which has lasted since the end of the Second World War. So the picture, you mentioned also the fact of the Baltic countries. So there Europe should play a very important role, but Europe right now would mean, for Europe to play such an important role would mean to allow Germany to play again the role of a power also from the military point of view, and yes, this would have repercussions of the balance which was reached after the Second World War.
And of course the Germans are...
This is Alberto Ghibellini's from Italy.
Oh, nice to meet you.
I mean, I did mention Italy because it doesn't count. So
it's the beautiful country.
Yes, you can discount everything he says.
Yeah, no, regarding foreign policy and military question.
Well, and of course, arguably the single biggest obstacle to German military rearmament is the Germans. I mean, the Germans have no interest in it, so there's no... German culture has changed so dramatically. There's no appetite for that whatsoever. On balance, that's probably for the best, but it does mean it's hard to get. It does mean it's hard to get that burden sharing that Americans always emphasize. You're right that the recession was real, but I do think that, and you're right to say that priorities were set, but that's a choice. You look at a budget, that reveals your priorities. President Obama made it quite clear from the beginning, we're going to increase domestic and decrease defense. That's a choice. It's going to be butter, not guns. That's the shift. That's been the shift under Obama. So that reflects his priorities, and obviously many Americans agree with it. I mean, he ran on it. But I don't think it was forced, strictly speaking. I think it's a choice. And then getting into 2012, 2013, I mean, the recession's been over for a while, you know, and now it's really a choice. So 2015, it's definitely a choice. I don't think it's forced anymore. On the point about Iraq, I said that there's lots of blame to go around, so I'll just make it explicit. The 2003 invasion, in the conventional phase, in some ways, it was well handled by the military, but the preparation for the post-war stability was obviously disastrous, and there's lots of blame to go around for that, and ultimately it goes up to the president, because there's nobody that can impose order on that process, not even the military or the Secretary of Defense, if the president doesn't make it happen. And he did not make it happen for lots of reasons, partly because Bush thought he was deferring to the generals. And they weren't interested in nation building either. So there was a rapid success in conventional terms, but very little preparation for what might come next. It was a case study in how not to do it. And so we all know what happened. I mean, lots of negative consequences and a violent chaos that, you know, was unleashed. Now, to Bush's credit, after he was finally convinced that it was a disaster and that there was an alternative, he actually did something very courageous, I think, which is he embraced a unpopular alternative, which escalated rather than disengaged. So it was counterintuitive in a way, and it worked surprisingly well. So 2007 and 8, the surge, you had increased troop presence, you had troops getting out of the bases and going and doing more what counterinsurgency doctrine would suggest. You had a doctrinal shift. Violence went down. Violence against civilians went down. U.S. casualties eventually went down. And then this situation was handed off to President Obama. And even though Obama campaigned against the war, he was quite responsible, I think, during the first couple of years in maintaining something that could have worked. I mean, in reality, he wasn't running away from Iraq in 2009-10. But what happened in 2011 was a kind of collapse. And there's some, and you know, and then you have to say the Iraqi government. I mean, let's remember. So clearly the Iraqi government should bear some responsibility for what happens inside Iraq. You had a government that for several years was seen by Sunni Arabs as a deadly enemy, to the point where some of them chose ISIS over their own government as a lesser evil. So that's serious. I mean, you're talking about a government that behaves in an aggressively sectarian way and that helped pave the rise of ISIS. So these are factors that go beyond the ability of any. You know, it's not simply up to the president to push a button and say Iraq will now look like this or that. But there are, you know, there are instruments we can use if we want to get serious.
Yes.
I just wanted to corroborate your earlier remark about how the decision to be influential in the region, in the world, especially in the Middle East. In the Middle East is a real choice. And it's not necessarily predicated by economic factors. Look at Iran or Russia; they're not exactly in the middle of an economic boom, and everyone in the region, in the Middle East, taking them seriously. And I think this is something that the U.S. can do for, yeah, not for evil purposes, but you know, for good, for a change. I mean, I think it's a matter of will.
Good. Yes, Henry.
I guess two questions. The first is it possible that Obama sees limited interventions as being actually too effective in overestimating the ability of America to project power through minor interventions with unprecedented use of sanctions or use of drone strikes, and seeing these as alternative treatments for new types of opponents or enemies. And then my other question is about recovery, or what comes after Obama. To what extent will both our enemies and our allies see this period as America, and how much will they see it as Barack Obama? And what does that have to do with the continuity between presidents and the strong examples?
Good. Good questions. On the limited intervention, I would say Obama's, he often talks about the arc of history, even on foreign policy. He's quite optimistic that as long as we don't overdo it, the trends will work in our favor. So, for example, we can sanction Russia. We don't need to be too aggressive or too provocative. Eventually, the model that Putin offers will fail because it's doomed. Right? And that's kind of a classically American thing. So there's an optimism there. Maybe that goes to your point about an excessive optimism about what a very small amount of coercion can do, because sanctions are a form of coercion. They're economic coercion. And you know, in reality, it's not changing really anyone's mind. There is a long American tradition of trying to achieve very ambitious goals through very limited means, trying to substitute technology for manpower, for example. You know, you think about presidents like Eisenhower and Nixon trying to say, and the pattern is they always come after some big conflict that was frustrating, like a Korea or Vietnam. I think that's what we're seeing today after Iraq and Afghanistan. Can we substitute covert action, drone strikes, intelligence, special ops? Can we keep these large numbers of forces off the ground? We've seen this before. And to some extent, it's understandable, right? But after a few years, the cycle always comes back, and you realize the limits of that approach, because that approach has its limits too. For example, you can't have a foreign policy that's just drone strikes. I mean, that's not going to do it. On your point about recovery post-Obama, if you believe, as I do, that there's some problems, one of the worrying things is that some of the problems are now baked in. I mean, you actually cannot literally undo the Iran deal January 2017 because it's now gone through an international process. So if somebody comes in from either party saying that they want to toughen up the U.S. line on Iran, they're going to be starting from further back. This is a problem. Now, on the other hand, one of the things I've found over the years is presidential leadership is so important in foreign policy. It's so central compared to other issue areas. It's astonishing, really, how much a president can get away with. And that can even be scary sometimes. But it makes such a difference that if you have a president who is determined to, let's say, have a more robust approach, that will make a great deal of difference, I think. But you're right to point out the continuities. I mean, Obama's been much more continuous with Bush than a lot of people would have liked to admit on right or left. I mean, there's been a lot of continuity on counterterrorism. That's pretty clear. The campaigns always sound like the distinctions are sharper, and in reality there's more continuity. And that will probably continue to be true for some very good structural reasons. I mean, if we're living in a post-Iraq, post-recession era, there's a bandwidth or a range of options beyond which you're not going to be able. I don't think the public is in the mood for another, major intervention. We're not over Iraq. We're not over it. So if you have a Republican president, or let's say a relatively hawkish Hillary Clinton, you're still you're still in the post-Iraq era. Yeah.
Well, we need to stop. I think everyone's had a question, and so thank you very much, Professor Dueck.
Thank you.